Welcome to the 360 Teaching and Learning podcast, an all-round look at student-centered education. I'm Adrian Pumphrey, and this week we talk with Professor Paul Kirschner, University Distinguished Professor at the Open University of the Netherlands and Visiting Professor of Education at the University of Oulu, Finland. Professor Kirschner has authored and co-authored many articles and books on interaction in learning, as well as computer-supported collaborative learning. His best-known works include the fallacy-busting books Urban Myths and More Urban Myths about learning and education. His most recent book publication, How Learning Happens, presents seminal works on learning and teaching from the fields of psychology and cognitive psychology. We were glad for the opportunity to talk briefly with Professor Kirschner and discuss project-based learning versus direct instruction, as well as hearing some of the main pitfalls that educators often fall into. Enjoy the episode. Well, Dr. Kirschner, thank you so much for joining us on the 360 Teaching and Learning podcast. It's a joy to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be speaking to you.
So at this point, you've written much, you've published a lot, you've published books and articles. I want to start thinking about what you think about problem-based, project-based learning. It's a big thing in the world of education right now is just thinking about what does project-based learning look like and what are the benefits of sort of maybe more constructivist ideas in the classroom. I would love to hear your concerns or thoughts on problem-based education, and some might call it inquiry learning.
That's a whole scala of things. I mean, many people understand very different things under what problem-based and project-based and discovery and inquiry-based learning and whatever. There are so many different things. If we bring it down to its fundamental parts, in order to carry out any project, in order to solve any problem, in order to do any type of meaningful inquiry, in order to discover anything in an effective or efficient way of value, you need the fundamental knowledge and skills to be able to do that. So my major problem is people who, or when people try to implement this without the necessary explicit instruction, without the gaining of the necessary prerequisite knowledge and skills in order to successfully, with value, solve a problem, carry out a project, or do a piece of inquiry. I mean, if I was to say it to you in the most simple way, I don't know if you're either a chess master or a quantum physicist.
Not yet.
But if the answer to both of those questions is no, I would be willing to challenge you to either solve a difficult chess problem or quantum mechanical problem without the necessary basic knowledge of chess. I'm talking about how pieces are, what the pieces are, how they move, strategy and tactics, and quantum physics. If you also so the situation is such that if I would give you the benefit of the doubt and say there are some benefits to project and problem-based learning, I would say there is absolutely no benefit without first having the prerequisite knowledge and skills. Okay. Having said that, the second aspect, reason why I have a problem with making use of it, is because it's often, even if you have the prerequisite knowledge and skills, neither effective nor efficient, and it's also often not very enjoyable. And people will look at you and say, "What do you mean? It's a lot of fun doing a project or carrying out a project." But if you get it wrong, if you're constantly hitting yourself against your head against the wall, you lose the motivation very, very quickly. So it might seem motivational to start on it, but if you don't achieve success in an effective and efficient way, it tends to be not very enjoyable at all, not very motivational at all. And if you eventually, with the problem, solve the problem, or the project, carry out the project, it's often the case that you don't know how you got there, because it's often via quite a lot of trial and error. So what you often see when people solve a problem is that given a similar problem, either to do the exact same thing but with different variables included in it, or do something that is a little bit different because one of the major underlying aspects, not surface level, but more deeper level aspects of it is different. What they'll do is they'll start again on the same trial and error way of doing it, because they've solved the problem, but they don't know how they've gotten there. Mm-hmm. So that means it's also very important to learn the procedure to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Before you do it. But often within the problem-based, project-based, you don't have that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't know the procedure that's supposed to be carried out. So you have to discover that on your own while doing it, which is also not very effective and not very efficient, because the next time you're confronted with a similar problem, you'll start again with this knowing nothing and not knowing how to do it. And it would be a lot better if you first learned the procedure for carrying it out. So that's, let's say, the second problem that I have with project-based and problem-based. The third problem that I have with it is that what you see at the moment is that people have learned that it doesn't work. So what they do is they add all types of instruction to it, and then they still call it problem-based or project-centered learning. Mm-hmm. Well, I call that good explicit instruction, in which at a certain point in time, you give the students the necessary freedom to use what they've learned to solve a problem, carry out a project, or whatever. So that's the third. It's actually giving in to the necessity of explicit instruction, but still trying to maintain that you're not doing it. The final thing is that it's often carried out in a collaborative way. And it might sound strange hearing this from an ex-professor of collaborative learning, because that was one of my learning chairs that I had when I was at the University of Utrecht, to say, well, you have a problem with collaborative learning. That's because most collaborative learning groups don't know how to collaborate in order to effectively or efficiently carry out their work. They're not a real team. They're just a group of learners there. And if your goal is to show how hard it is to work with other people in a group to solve something, then it's great to work collaboratively. But it's often not the most effective and efficient or even enjoyable way, because a lot of people get very frustrated by working in a team, to learn what you're supposed to learn. You might make that project, but the idea is, the goal is not to make the project, but it's to learn. I often compare that with, we have this project dealing with what's it called? Volcanism. I have to think of the English word. And so you have these students working together or even alone, making these beautiful paper mache volcanoes and painting it and putting chemicals in it, or putting Coca-Cola and Mentos mints in it so that it explodes and it looks like a real volcano. They spent 2 weeks doing this, but they still don't know what volcanism is, because that's not what they were doing. They were doing this project on it. And if you ask them, but how does that work? We're talking about moving plates and the Earth's core and eruptions and things like that. They have no idea about it, because they were busy with this project making this beautiful volcano. Yeah, but they have no idea what volcanism is. But that was the goal. And I probably could have taught that to them in 15 minutes of explicit instruction, supported possibly by some video within that explicit instruction, and then given them some questions about it and discussed it. And within an hour, they would have known everything about volcanism that they needed to know, and not spent 2 weeks and still know nothing about volcanism. So those are 4 different aspects of why I have a problem with problem-based and project-based, let alone inquiry and discovery learning.
So tell me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that problem-based learning in itself is not the issue. It's actually a lack of explicit instruction to do it well.
well, then it's no longer problem. I would say making use of problems and solving problems within the instruction. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as long as it's within a context of good explicit instruction. Because I mean, if you look at the work of Baruch Rosenshine, and I could give an hour and a half lecture about that, he gives 10 steps or 10 aspects of it, of which guided problem solving, or let's call it problem solving, and then independent problem solving are 2 of the 10 steps. But there are 8 other aspects of it that also need to be included. So it's a part of it, but calling it problem-based learning is kind of like calling teaching without a computer textbook-based learning. No, it's just learning. Yeah, and you're making use of problems or projects within a proper context in a good pedagogic way.
So what I'm getting from that, maybe it's a problem with the word based, right? What are we basing our learning on? Is it the problem? Maybe not.
No.
We're just using problems to...
You're applying what you've learned to the problem so that it becomes contextualized in the situation in which it should be used. But I would call that contextualized learning.
Yeah. You, interestingly, in one of your papers, note that the advantage of guidance begins to recede only when learners have sufficiently high prior knowledge to provide internal guidance.
Exactly.
When is that point reached for the student?
It depends. You can't say this is the point. When you have enough knowledge plus the cognitive schemata in your head that you can interpret the problem in the proper way. I mean, if you want to do it dichotomously, you would say the novice can't and the expert can. Because the expert has the cognitive schemas, it's all internalized, sees the world differently than the novice. And where along that scale for a specific problem you can do that, there's no magical test in which I can do it. I can say it. But it's along the continuum from being knowing nothing to knowing everything. And actually, discovery, inquiry, that's the epistemology of the expert. That's the way the expert gains new knowledge. That's the way the scientist gains new knowledge. And through instruction is the way the novice gains new knowledge. And somewhere along that continuum, you will see people going over from one to the other. And it's not as a whole, it could be with respect to one certain thing and not to something else. And for that, you need a good teacher who can feel when that is. Absolutely. I can't give you a test.
Okay. I was hoping for just like one check, one question that would solve all.
Everybody wants that one simple answer. Learning and instruction is not that simple.
I appreciate it doesn't quite work like that way. Going to the beginning of the learning process at this point, I'm thinking about, I'm a mathematics teacher.
Okay, I used to be a mathematics teacher.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. One question you will have heard often is, when am I going to use this? Or why do I need to learn this? So,
I don't think that's really necessary.
Yeah.
I wrote a very nice blog, if I say it myself, about dealing with the value of worthless knowledge. Yeah, based upon, I think it was a 1930-something article in Harper's Magazine. But in any event, the goal of teaching and education is not, what am I going to use it for? It's to become learned. Yeah. If you're in a vocational high school, then I understand it. Yeah. Because then you're using it for that. But if you're in a normal elementary or junior high school or high school, the idea is to become learned and not to do something. Yeah, that's the different. That's for me quite a different thing. And so it's not important for me to tell someone when exactly will you use it. I use it every day. The mathematics that I learned, and maybe it might not be the quadratic equation at that moment, but there are variations on it. Even when it comes to solving theorems and postulates, making use of logic, understanding that the inverse and the converse of a statement aren't necessarily true, but the contrapositive is. I learned that when I was learning about how to determine whether two isosceles triangles are congruent or not. Yeah, so but I use it every day, because if it rains, the street is wet. That doesn't mean that if the street is wet, it has rained. But a lot of people argue and think in this way, and that's because they never quite learn. When am I going to use it? Yeah, when you're discussing something with someone and they come with a statement that's completely absurd. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's necessary in any event, if you're not talking about vocational education, to constantly give a reason why they should learn it.
I'm thinking that I have students that love learning just for learning's sake, and that's always great to have in the classroom. I have students that don't love learning for learning's sake. What would you encourage teachers to
ensure success?
Okay, what does that look like?
Ensure success. What does it look like? That means sometimes making smaller steps, having the student experience accomplishment. Mm-hmm. Because I mean, where you're coming from with the question is as if you think, and I'm not putting words in your mouth or in any way propagating the idea that motivation leads to learning. But research has clearly shown that motivation doesn't lead to learning. Motivation is important. It's great to motivate students, yeah, but motivation doesn't lead to learning. But learning, accomplishment, does lead to further motivation. And the case is often that learners have experienced frustration and then find that they don't want to learn. I mean, if your goal in football, as we would call it as Europeans, you Americans would call it soccer, yeah. If your goal is to learn to take a free kick and to bend it like Beckham, yeah, then you're really motivated to do that. Mm-hmm. And you put up the dummies, and afterwards you're completely motivated, and you train extra, and you kick and you kick and you kick, and it constantly goes into the dummies or completely wide, and it never bends. Yeah. And at a certain point, without good proper instruction, yeah, or taking it step by step, you'll eventually think, okay, free kicks, that's not my terrain. I'll give that to someone else. She had a good instructor who came and said, no, Adrian, when you place your foot, hit it with the outside of your foot this way, and it'll probably bend a little bit. And you get that, and you see it, and oh, it works. And you're motivated to continue and try it again. And then the teacher comes and says, okay, but now you have to plant if you're right-footed, your left foot there, and you'll get more of a curve in it. And it'll actually, and you experience success, and you're motivated to continue and do it. It's just that simple, taking small steps. And it's often, well, I've taught it, I've explained it to you, here, do it. Some kids can, some kids can't. Maybe the steps should be smaller, let them experience success. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay?
I know you've co-written a book on urban myths, a couple of books on, yes. Urban myths and more urban myths. What are some of the key things that we as educators need to be aware of as we hear all these sort of trends and new ideas coming out? What are the?
If it sounds too good, it probably isn't. Okay. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't. If it's offered as a one-off remedy for everything, it isn't. Mm-hmm. You have to look at who's been saying it. For example, if you look at schools kill creativity, yeah, a very famous thing from Sir Ken Robinson.
Right, yeah? Right. We've all seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to look at also who said it. Sir Ken Robinson is a professor of theater. He knows nothing about teaching and education. Why should I believe him? Because he's called Professor or Sir Ken. Sugata Mitra over, we don't need to teach children anything. It's all on the internet and on their telephone. Now, Sugata Mitra is a solid-state physicist who got his PhD in with transistors, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
What does he know about how people learn? For that example, for that matter, what does the often misquoted Albert Einstein know about learning?
Mm-hmm.
Who said it? There are so many red flags that come up, and using a little bit of just common sense, that we can multitask. Yeah, people say it constantly that they're aping that constantly, and I say, have you ever sat in front of the television watching the news and your partner comes in and asks you a question and you talk to her or him for 30 seconds, a minute and a half? And then do you really know what the newscaster actually said? They say, no, I was busy with something else. He said, in other words, you were cognitively engaged with your partner at that moment, so you couldn't be cognitively engaged with what the newscaster was saying. But in other words, you can't multitask. You can't cognitively process two pieces of information at the same time. You can't multitask. Oh, were you ever in a meeting when all of a sudden a WhatsApp or an email came and you looked at your telephone and you gave a quick answer, and the head of the department said to you, and Adrian, what do you think? And you had to go in all types of things like, well, maybe could you rephrase the question? It wasn't quite clear to me. Why? You heard him or her ask the question. You weren't all of a sudden deaf,
Mm-hmm.
but you were busy cognitively processing the WhatsApp that you got and your answer to it, so that you weren't cognitively processing what the head of the department or the chair of the meeting was saying or asking. But using a little bit of common sense is enough to actually disprove many of the myths. Take learning styles. What type of learner are you, Adrian? Well, I'm actually a visual learner. I say, oh, okay. Now I'm going to try to visually teach you how to play the piano, or what a sonata by Mozart sounds like. No, you have to listen to that. No, but you're a visual learner. You can't learn anything auditorially, because that's the definition of it. Yeah, but I prefer seeing things. I said, yeah, but that's a preference. That's not a learning style. Oh, what do you prefer to eat? Well, I like this, I like that. I said, well, most of the things you like seem to be either fatty or sweet or sugary. Yeah, that's your eating preference. Is that a good diet? No. Well, what you're saying is, if someone prefers hearing it, that's a good learning diet for him or her.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't it a good eating diet to eat what you prefer? But why is it a good learning diet to learn the way you prefer, which is usually the least energy expensive way, leaning back and listening and watching.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those types of things, using a little bit of common sense is enough to debug most of the myths you come across.
Speaking of cognitive processing, we are talking a lot at our school right now about mind-brain education and trying to, marry what we're hearing in brain science with pedagogy and making our teaching and learning better.
Yeah.
And so what have you found to be helpful when considering these things? And what do you think are some pitfalls that we should be aware of?
But I think helpful is that most neuropsychologists understand that we only have one brain and that we're not left-brained or right-brained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those types of things. The major problem is the distance between the level of research, and I'm not talking that it's better or worse, but studying things at the neural and subneural level, which is what brain scientists, neuroscientists do. The step to that and learning is incredibly large. It's kind of like the step from what happens in the mitochondria to running a marathon. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's happening in the mitochondria is really important for running a marathon. But knowing what's happening in the mitochondria will not help me shave 20 seconds off of my marathon time, and won't help me run a better marathon. So it's good that it's being studied in that level, at that level, sorry, but the distance between that level and the conclusions that people, both neuropsychologists and teachers, are drawing from it, that is such a gap that at this point in time, that gap can't be bridged. Yeah, it can give you some insights. Looking at fMRI of someone solving a problem can tell you what regions of the brain are doing the most work by the blood flow going to it, but it doesn't give you any idea about how to teach it. And people who think that you can draw those conclusions from knowing that it's in the amygdala as opposed to the prefrontal cortex, they're deluding themselves and others and not making use of it the way it should. It's kind of like looking at subatomic quantum physics. We know that it's really necessary for what's going on in the real world, but what's happening at the level of quarks and quanta really won't help us throw a baseball better, which is also pure physics.
So what would you encourage in the meantime, while we're waiting for that gap to be bridged? Do we just carry on, or do we just
carry on? We make use of what educational psychologists and cognitive psychologists are doing, hoping that they're making good use of what's coming out of the neuropsychologists, making the first step from what's happening there to how we process information, and based upon that, coming up with ideas of how we can more effectively, efficiently, and enjoyably teach students, or have students learn and have teachers teach. So it's kind of like going through 4 or 5 or 6 steps from the chemical process to the cake. Yeah? From making bicarbonate of soda in the lab to making use of it as a cook in cooking. And in a lot of simple chemistry, we've made those steps. So we now know that we used to have baking soda only. If we had baking soda, we had to add vinegar or lemon or buttermilk to our recipe, because we needed the acid. We understood a bit of that chemistry, and all of a sudden they added that to the baking soda and they made baking powder from it. So now you can do it with milk instead of buttermilk, which is actually acidic. Okay, so those steps have been taken, but we're nowhere near that if we're looking at what's happening at the neuro level, the cell level, the dendrite level of what's going on in our head, to how you should teach. Dan Willingham wrote a great 2 or 3 pager for American Educator, I think it was, about that. I take a look at Dan Willingham's work about bridging the gap from neuro to cognitive and educational psychology in the classroom. I suggest that they look at the book that I wrote with Carl Hendrick from London, How Learning Happens. Because in that book, we try to explain to teachers, policymakers in education, how what we've learned from 50 to 100 years of cognitive psychology and educational psychology, how that can be used in the classroom. It took quite a number of years for that to go from where it was when it was studied to what you can do with it in the classroom, it'll take as many years to go or more to go from neuro to cognitive psychology. So try looking at how learning happens as a third book along with the 2 learning myths books.
Well, Dr. Kirschner, I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode. That was Professor Paul Kirschner, University Distinguished Professor at the Open University of the Netherlands, and co-author of Urban Myths and More Urban Myths about Learning and Education. For links to Professor Kirschner's works, do check out today's show notes. If you've enjoyed today's episode, you can help us get the word out by leaving a 5-star review at itunes.com. The 360 Teaching and Learning podcast is produced by Park Tudor School. Our executive producer is Brent Kneft and our editor is Adrian Pumphrey. To listen to previous episodes of the 360 Teaching and Learning podcast, head to 360podcast.org or subscribe by searching for 360 Teaching and Learning wherever you get your podcasts.